It's time that we talk about the rumors surrounding the next generation Subaru BRZ and Toyota GR86. I would say over maybe the last year and a half, there have been a series of stories making the rounds that basically say that the next generation Toyota GR86 is going to be turbocharged and that the Subaru BRZ is going to be discontinued. And just in the past month, this narrative has really started to pick up traction again with a new story being published by Forbes. So today we are going to dive headfirst into this speculation. We're going to talk about what even is being reported here and see if it even makes sense for either one of these automakers. We'll start with just a quick history of the 86 and BRZ. The first generation car came out for the 2013 model year, and it was a joint venture between Subaru and Toyota, with the idea being to build an affordable, small, lightweight sports car, which was a segment that was massively popular in the 1990s, but went into a pretty steep decline during the 2000s. For the US market, the Subaru version of this car was simply branded as a BRZ. But for Toyota, they decided to put this car under their Scion sub-brand, and it was branded as the FRS. And largely, I would say that these cars were met with pretty positive reviews. They got praised for things like a nimble chassis, great steering feel, and an engaging driving experience. But what would ultimately kind of be the Achilles heel of these cars would be the powertrain, and a specific feature of that powertrain: the torque dip. The engine that was used in these cars was a 2-liter naturally aspirated boxer 4-cylinder engine. It made around 200 horsepower, which meant that it was pretty competitive with this car's competition with vehicles like the Miata or the Civic Si, but it had a major problem. Because the way that the power was delivered made the car feel a lot slower to drive. That's because for most cars, generally speaking, power gradually builds throughout the RPM range. But for the BRZ in 86, torque drops significantly around 4,000 RPM, which is typically the time that most engines are really starting to come on. So as a result, the car just feels slow. Now, there are some people that argue that the torque dip is not that big of a deal. But as the owner of a 2016 Subaru BRZ, I can confidently say that it is a problem, and honestly, it's probably my least favorite thing about the car. So as a result of this, one of the most popular modifications that people do in the aftermarket is adding forced induction. And nowadays, there are a myriad of different turbo and supercharger kits that you can get for these cars. But outside of the aftermarket, the question that everyone was asking Subaru and Toyota is when they would be coming out with a factory turbocharged version of one of these cars. And specifically for Subaru, they were already building a turbocharged version of this engine for use in their other cars. But the answer that we were always met with was a resounding no, and they did give a few reasons as to why. The first was packaging. They argued that adding a turbocharger, an intercooler, and all of that additional hardware, it just simply wouldn't fit under the hood of the BRZ or 86. And to be honest, I never really put that much stock into this theory, seeing as the aftermarket had figured it out with relative ease. Another argument that they put forward was that by adding a turbo, it would ruin these cars' center of gravity. One of the big marketing points that they had for these cars was a low center of gravity that provided really good handling characteristics. And they argued that by adding all of this hardware, it would ruin that handling. And again, this was a theory that I never put that much stock into, just because there are turbocharged front engine cars out there that have a comparable center of gravity to the BRZ in 86. And the third, and what I think is likely the most honest answer given by Subaru and Toyota, is that by adding a turbocharger, it would also add complexity and weight and ultimately cost. A forced induction version of this car would easily cost an additional $8,000 to $10,000, which would kind of defeat the purpose of building an affordable sports car. And the last reason as to why they don't want to build a turbocharged BRZ or 86, which I never heard directly from Toyota or Subaru, but is likely a primary factor, is that this new car would directly compete with the Supra. So considering all of these different points, it really wasn't that much of a surprise that when they rolled out the second generation car in 2021, it did not feature the turbocharged powertrain that we were all asking for. Some changes they did make for the second gen car: they rebranded the Scion FRS into the GR86, and they added more power with the addition of a 2.4 liter naturally aspirated boxer 4-cylinder engine that now made 228 horsepower, but more importantly, it flattened the torque dip. But even with this improvement, there were still a ton of people in the automotive community that still really wanted to see a turbocharged version of these cars. And for these people, it seemed like their dream may finally be coming true when in 2023, a bunch of Japanese car magazines, including Best Car and MagX, started reporting that a turbocharged GR86 was in development. Now, these stories really caught a lot of attention, and there were a ton of mainstream automotive outlets that were parroting these stories, as well as people on social media talking about it as well. And again, with this big Forbes story that just got published, it's stirring the pot up all over again. And before we go any further, there is something that I have to confess, and that is that I do not speak Japanese. I can't interpret these stories myself and instead have to rely either on translations or summaries that are provided by other people. So as a result of this, these Japanese car magazines, I'm not really reading their stories all that regularly, and it's really tough to tell what level of rigor or fact-checking gets put into their stories. There's some people online that say that these magazines are basically just tabloids and that they'll print whatever sells, but it does seem that more often or not, they do have an inside line at many of these Japanese car companies. My point here is that these sources are a little bit questionable and that you do need to take some of these rumors and speculations with a grain of salt. But the point of this video is not to dissect the actual sources of this information. It's to talk about whether this is even plausible for these two automakers, regardless of what's being reported. So let's start with exactly what is being speculated so far. Now, there are a few different versions of this story, but the key themes that it kind of boils down to is that Subaru is no longer interested in producing the BRZ, so it's going to be discontinued for the third generation, and Toyota is going to fully take over development of the GR86. And because it will solely be a Toyota product, the 4-cylinder boxer engine is out, and instead the next generation GR86 is going to be powered by a hybrid version of the GR Corolla's 1.6 liter turbocharged 3-cylinder engine. And this new car will make somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 horsepower, and it'll be released sometime around 2028. So let's break this story down piece by piece, and we'll start with the divorce between Subaru and Toyota. First, it's worth mentioning that the Subaru of today is a much different company than the Subaru of 2013 when they originally came out with the BRZ. They are a far more successful automaker now, and their bread and butter is really selling these kind of mass market, quote unquote, normie vehicles. They seem much less interested in producing performance cars, and I think this is pretty clear with how they have watered down the current generation WRX and discontinued the STI model. And I've also got a whole video on that if you're interested in learning more. Meanwhile, for Toyota, they seem to have a renewed interest in performance cars under the leadership of Akio Toyoda, with the explosion of the GR brand. It's also been reported that there has been some turnover at both companies, and that the folks that originally brokered the deal to co-produce this car between Subaru and Toyota are no longer at their respective companies. And lastly, just to emphasize the difference in priorities between these two automakers as of late, the GR86 is absolutely crushing the BRZ in terms of sales, despite them basically being the same exact car. Largely, I do think it is totally possible that Subaru has no interest in co-developing a new sports car and that Toyota pushes ahead all by themselves. But the question that then raises for Toyota is, what are they going to do about the Supra? And while that is a totally valid question, I think there's a few things that we need to take into account. For one, the current generation of Supra that is on sale today is actually slightly older than the current generation GR86. So it's possible that the Supra gets a complete overhaul before we get the next generation 86. But of course, the Supra is co-developed between Toyota and BMW, so potentially there could be a little bit of friction there, but that is a story all in of itself. One other story that broke recently is that Toyota is discontinuing the 4-cylinder Supra, which is great news for the GR86. Realistically, the most logical way to add a turbo GR86 to the lineup is by moving the Supra up market by adding more power and more performance. Of course, by adding a turbocharged engine to the 86, it would also be moving that model up market as well, which would potentially open a spot at the very end of Toyota's performance car lineup. And what also might lend a little bit more credibility to this theory is that it's also being speculated right now that Toyota plans to add a Miata competitor to their lineup, so this vehicle could potentially fill that slot. Overall, just to zoom out, I do think that it is plausible that Toyota could add a turbo 86 to their lineup, despite the existence of the Supra. Next, let's dive into the speculation surrounding this actual powertrain itself. There is a little bit of mixed reporting here, but I would say the overall consensus is that the 86 would use a detuned version of the GR Corolla engine with the addition of an electric motor to make it a hybrid powertrain. Now, performance hybrids aren't new, and we've seen them at the high end of the car market for the past decade, but it's just now starting to trickle down into more entry-level performance cars. And Toyota has also made it abundantly clear that they think the future is in hybrids and not necessarily in full electric vehicles. And the big news as of late is that Honda is going to be bringing back the Prelude as a performance hybrid. Of course, this Prelude does basically look like it's just going to be a rebranded Civic, but it does lend credibility to the prevalence of performance hybrids in this segment. And there's one more point about the powertrain that I want to touch on, and that is the existence of a manual transmission. Believe it or not, Toyota is actually the brand right now that sells the most different models that are available with a manual transmission. And a key part of the 86's character of being a bare bones affordable sports car is the manual transmission. But you might be asking how this would possibly work with a hybrid powertrain. Well, there have been a ton of leaks over the past year that suggest that Toyota is working on developing a manual transmission for performance hybrid applications, which I also think helps lend some credibility to this theory surrounding the GR86. So with all of that being said, let's just take it from the top one more time and talk through if this seems plausible. For one, enthusiasts have been begging Subaru and Toyota to produce a turbocharged version of these cars for years, so I certainly think that the demand is there. Subaru seems less interested in building performance cars than ever before, while Toyota seems more than happy to do so. So I certainly think it is within the realm of possibility that Toyota develops the third generation car by themselves. Not to mention that the GR86 is currently outselling the BRZ quite substantially. In regards to Toyota having brand infighting between a Turbo 86 and the Supra, well, the 4-cylinder Supra has been discontinued, and the regular Supra will be due for a refresh around the same time that the new 86 is slated to come out. And in regards to the powertrain, we already know that Toyota loves hybrids, and if they're gonna build the third gen 86 by themselves, a hybrid version of the GR Corolla's engine is a pretty logical choice. And not to mention that we already know that Toyota is working on a manual transmission for performance hybrid applications. So taking this all into account, while the source of these rumors might be a little bit suspect, I do think that it is more likely than not that there is some truth behind them. Of course, this car is still 4 years away, so things are going to be subject to change, but I do believe that we will be seeing a turbocharged engine in the next generation of the GR86.